So knowing that 60% of our diet should be carbohydrates, we need to make a conscious effort to make sure that many of those carbohydrates we eat in a day are whole grains. Right here you see an image of a whole grain, and it looks like a little seed, and it remains intact. A whole grain has 3 parts, all of which are present. It has the bran, which is the outer covering, which is the outside of the grain. And you can see that that contains fiber and vitamins and minerals. It has the flour, which provides energy to the body, and it also has the germ. And inside that germ is wonderful nutrients of vitamins, minerals, and healthy fats. Now, a whole grain is eaten in its complexity, and it hasn't been processed by any means. Now, what's happening in today's society is a lot of people are processing grains, and they're taking out the bran and the germ, and all that's left is the flour. And what they're doing is, with that flour, is they will be making processed breads, rice, pasta, bakery, sugar in its simplest sense, candies, sodas, different things like that. When we process the grain, it loses all the healthy nutrients that the human body needs to stay healthy and to function. When we process a grain and we take away the bran and the germ, we're losing all the vitamins, all the minerals, all the healthy fats, and all the fiber, and all that's left is white flour. And that has a dramatic impact to our health. And here's another image of a whole grain. What I've mentioned to you before is some companies are taking out the bran and the germ. And the reason they're taking that away is that if we have a whole grain product that is not processed, the shelf life of that product is only going to be a few weeks. It's not going to be able to stay on the shelf and make money for the companies for long periods of time. So the companies decided, well, let's take away the germ, let's take away the bran, and all that's left is this white flour. And the shelf life of a simple white flour with no vitamins, minerals, fats in it is going to be a few years. So what ends up happening is the companies that use processed flours or processed grains, they can sell their product for long periods of time and make more money, versus a company that is using a whole grain. That type of product is only going to last for a few weeks, and then they would have to dispose of it because it would become rancid, because the nutrients don't last very long. So a lot of it is done for monetary reasons. Also, it takes longer for the whole grains to cook and also to chew and digest. So what ends up happening is, if people are in a hurry, they don't want to wait to cook the whole grain, or maybe perhaps chew as long or as hard. If you've ever had the opportunity to have whole grain pasta versus white processed pasta, you'll notice that the processed pasta that cooks maybe 8-10 minutes at most, and you can eat lots of it, versus the whole grain where it's going to take you 15, maybe 20 minutes to cook that. Now, what happens to our health is, when we're eating the whole grains and we're taking in the bran and germ, that does a couple of different things. First, it fills us up. Our belly notes the signal to our brain that we're full, because the bran, the fiber, the healthy fat within the germ, and the vitamins and minerals within the germ are going to signal to our brain that we're full. Our appetite will be shut off, and we won't want to eat as much. If all we're eating is the white flour that does not have fiber, does not have healthy fats, doesn't have the vitamins and minerals, the only thing we're getting with the flour is the calories, but not the healthy nutrients, our appetite will always be high. Nothing is in our system to signal our brain to stop eating, and you can eat maybe a pound of pasta. Sure, your belly might be full, but that brain is not signaling that your appetite should be shut off. If all we're eating is processed grains, the person will be continually hungry and continually have a high appetite. And this is what's happening in today's society. If people are eating all types of processed grains, white breads, white flours, white pasta, bakery, sugars, they never feel full, and they're constantly eating. If we switch back to eating whole grains that contain the bran and germ, that our brains would, and our stomachs as well, would notice that we have all these healthy, nutrient-dense foods in our body, and it would shut off our appetite, and we would be full and not continually eat. Here's a couple of different pictures of whole grains, and I have a list coming up in this slideshow, different types of grains, but corn, oats, barley, and wheat are typical types of whole grains. You can cook them as is and then eat them in their whole situation, which you see right here. You can actually break it down but not remove the bran and germ and still make things out of. And in these images, you can see that The grain was still whole, but it was broken apart, and then companies could make bread out of it, pasta out of it, cereals out of it. So we can eat a whole grain bread or a whole grain pasta. It may not look like that little seed, because basically that little seed was just chopped up, and then it was utilized to form new food products. But a similar sense would be like if we had a coffee bean. The coffee bean is ground up before it is put into the coffee pot, but nothing is taken away from it. And in this sense, we could grind up like a whole wheat grain. We could grind that up, and then with all the powdery substance that comes out of that, make bread or make pasta. Now, the bran and germ are still in the product, although it was broken up, but it's still considered a whole grain. And that's why one of the most healthiest types of foods we can eat would be a bread, a pasta, or something made from the whole grain that hasn't been processed with the bran and the germ taken away. And here's a list of whole grains that are typically found in the diet, and there's a lot of options here. And you can eat them whole, which would be just to cook them. Typically when we cook a whole grain, we have 1 cup of grain to 2 cups of liquid, perhaps water or broth, and then we would eat that. So for instance, oatmeal, if you wanted to eat oatmeal in the morning, it would be about 1 cup of oats to 2 cups of water. That would make quite a bit. A serving size would really be a half a cup of oats to 1 cup of water, and that would be a whole grain. You can eat them in their whole grain state, or they could be ground up and made into breads and bagels and muffins and different things like that. But the most important thing is that they say whole. Other words that we could look for is cracked, for instance, whole wheat, cracked wheat, rolled wheat, stone ground wheat. And those things would still be considered a whole grain, or the products that are made out of that. What we want to avoid in terms of carbohydrates are processed grains more than anything else. So if we reflect back, I said 60% of our diet should be complex carbohydrates, mostly whole grains and vegetables. We want to minimize the amount of processed grains we eat. Processed grains are what's causing the majority of obesity, chronic diseases in our society, because people are eating processed grains and they're constantly hungry. They're constantly looking for more food, even though they're eating a quantity of food. They're not eating nutrient-dense food, so they're not getting the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber, the healthy fat that their brains are needing, so they're constantly have an appetite to try to seek out those healthy nutrients. And if all we're eating is processed grains, we're never going to get them. What we want to avoid are the flours. If anything on an ingredient list says enriched flour or refined flour or processed flour, even if it says enriched wheat flour, the whole point is it's saying it's flour, meaning that the bran and the germ were taken away. Those are processed carbohydrates. The product was made with a processed carbohydrate. Those things act like simple carbohydrates more so than the complex ones. And what's going to happen with a processed grain, it's going to enter the bloodstream very quickly. We're going to have to process that into body fat, and in order to do so, it takes a large toll on our insulin. So the insulin is going to work overtime to take that carbohydrate out of the bloodstream and put it in as fat, particularly. And we don't want to continually do that day after day after day. It's going to increase our body weight, and it's also going to increase our risk for chronic diseases. So if we were to label something as a bad type of carbohydrate, it would be the processed grains. Those are the things that are causing problems in our food supply system today. It may be challenging at first to decide if a product that we're eating is a whole grain or not. I mean, certainly if it looks like an oat or the entire seed is intact of wheat, we would realize that that's a whole grain. But if we picked up a loaf of bread and we were having trouble deciding if that was whole grain or not, we would first read the ingredient list. Does it say whole wheat or cracked wheat? And that's it, with no other words around it. That would be considered a whole grain. But if it says whole wheat flour, and the key word there being flour, that means it was processed. That means the bran and germ were taken away. It could be confusing. Maybe the companies want us to be confused a little bit so that we're not sure what we're buying. But one sure way to determine if something is whole grain or not is to look for the whole grain stamp. And here you see an image of these things. If it's a 100% whole grain stamp, that means everything in that product is a whole grain. So if we see that on our cereal or bread, we're ensured that all the product is whole grain. If you see the one on the left, it just says whole grain. It doesn't have a percentage on it. That means part of the product is whole grain, but not all. And we're going to assume that half of the grains in that product are whole, and then the other half are probably processed. But look for the stamps, and specifically look for the one that says 100% whole grain if we're looking for pastas, breads, muffins, bagels, things like that. It's one way to help us identify a whole grain versus a processed grain. We'll find out later this semester how many servings of carbohydrates you should have in a day, and most of us will be between 8 to 12 servings of carbohydrates per day. We want to aim for about half of them being whole grains. Minimum 3 servings of whole grain per day, and here's some options of what we can eat to get those whole grains. Again, avoid as much as possible the processed white breads, white rice, white pastas, bakery, candy. That's all processed. We want to go for the ones that are still intact, and here's some options for you here. I encourage you to click on or copy and paste these net addresses and spend about 10 minutes on each site learning about different options you have for whole grains. So these 2 things here are for references to learn more. And it's very important if you want to control your weight and prevent disease to start consuming whole versus processed grains. So taking those 10 minutes now to learn the differences between those kind of things is worthwhile and important to your knowledge and health.